You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
All right, folks, happy Thursday evening. This is Scotty Roberts. You're watching my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. Well, on Odyssey, you're really just listening. That's where the audio version of this show plays. Go to odysy1.com. See all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. And you can come on over to my YouTube channel where you can watch this show in its video broadcast. But the best part about the YouTube channel, you can join the live chat room where the other Intrepids are gathering now and chatting even now as this show begins. Come on over, throw your 2 cents worth in, meet some of the people over there, have a good time. That's at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, if you're watching the video, you'll see down below me here is my scroll bar. That'll give you all the different places where you can find out more about what I do, more about this show. It's got intrepidradio.com. It's got my Etsy page for my Son of a Patriot, which is right here. You see the logo if you're looking in video. You can see all the different t-shirts and garments that we put together, many of them based on the topics we do in these shows. You can also find my main website, scottallenroberts.com, where if you need some good graphic design, some good illustration work, book cover designs, corporate identity, logos, anything like that, I've been doing it for, well, as my wife says in the ad, longer than she's been alive. So I've been doing this for 42 years. As a graphic designer, if you need any work, that's where you know where to come. And take a look at my stuff or get a hold of me, message me personally. There. That's my private business ad for the beginning of this show. Let's move into it. I want to jump right back in to where we left off yesterday, mostly because this is this topic, this particular event. I've got a lot of information still to go through here. And this is kind of a narrative of what happened with Red Cloud's war. And as you saw, and I don't need to recap too deeply, but Native Americans had been pushed across the 95th meridian for the permanent Indian frontier back in 1830. We're now in 1865, and this is 35 years later, and they've been pushed out of that by white settlers seeking gold. You've got the military coming in, building forts all along their territory. You've got from the west, where we settled in California and all along the west coast, pushing in from the Rocky Mountains. And so many of these tribes are now, you're talking about the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Cherokee, the Crow, the Creek. All of these are all being pushed into Nebraska, a little bit of Kansas, Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas. And so there's new incursions into their land now. And they've been trying to write treaties to redo the treaties because they've all been broken by the white settlers. They've all been broken by the United States. And that's where we're in the midst of this now. And now they want to have a road, the Bozeman Trail, that's going through Indian land to mostly accommodate settlers that are coming out and gold seekers and things like that. And of course, Red Cloud walked out of the peace meetings because they caught wind, or they met the soldiers that were coming in to build the road, and they hadn't even signed the treaty yet. So he said, wait a minute, you're calling us to discuss the terms of this, and you've already got the soldiers here to build the road that we haven't agreed to. They're already here with their wagon trains full of equipment to build the road, to start settlements, to build new forts. I'm out. And he walked out. And so now we've got these columns that have brought in. And I just want to look at where we're going to recap just a touch. By June 28th of 1866 now, the regiment had reached Fort Reno. They relieved the 2 companies of the Yankees that had been left there, who during the winter and the spring had kept virtual prisoners within their own stockade. They were dying of scurvy, the elements. They didn't have food, and now they got relieved. And they had to garrison Fort Reno. And Carrington, Colonel Carrington, left about 1/4 of his regiment and then went and moved north searching for a site for his headquarters post. And from the Indian camps along the Powder and the Tongue rivers, hundreds of warriors now began gathering along the flanks of the military train, and they're keeping an eye on them. And on July 13th, the column halted. This is 1866, so we're at July 16th today, so pretty close to an anniversary date that we just passed 3 days ago. But on July 13th of 1866, this huge column halted between the forks of the Little Piney River and the Big Piney Creeks. The Little and Big Piney Creeks. And there in the heart of a luxuriant grassland near the pine-clad slopes of the Bighorn Mountains and on the best hunting grounds of the Plains Indians, the Bluecoats pitched their army tents and they began building Fort Phil Kearny. Now, 3 days later, a large party of Cheyennes approached the encampment. Two Moon, Black Horse, and Dull Knife were among the leaders. But Dull Knife kept in the background because the other chiefs had been chiding him severely for remaining at Fort Laramie and signing the paper, which gave the soldiers permission to build forts and open the Powder River Road. Now, Dull Knife insisted that he had touched the pen at Laramie in order to obtain presents of blankets and ammunition. And he didn't know what was written on the paper. Remember, they're a paperless society, Native Americans. So yet the others rebuked him for doing this, after Red Cloud had turned his back on the white men, and disdaining their presence and gathering his warriors to defy them. So this is where we are now. Under the truce flags, the Cheyenne arranged a parley with the little white chief Carrington. 40 chiefs and warriors were given permission to visit the soldier camp. So Carrington met with them, with the military band that he'd brought all the way from Fort Kearny in Nebraska, and entertaining the Indians with spiritual martial music. Blanket Jim Bridger was there, and they knew that they could fool the Blanket, but they didn't fool Little White Chief into believing they had come to talk of peace. And while the pipe smoking and the preliminary speeches were going on, the chiefs studied the power of the soldiers. They're inside now, and they're getting a look around. And before they were ready to depart, the Little White Chief sighted one of his howitzers at the hill and exploded a spherical case shot upon it. "It shoots twice," Black Horse said with forced solemnity. "White Chief shoot once." Then White Chief's great spirit fires it once more for his white children. Now, the power of the big gun impressed the Indians, as Carrington had hoped it would. But he didn't suspect that Black Horse was deriding him with that bland remark about the Great Spirit firing it. Once more for his white children. When the Cheyennes prepared to leave, the Little White Chief gave them pieces of paper saying that they had agreed to a lasting peace with whites and all travelers along the new road. And they departed. Now, within a few hours, villages along the Tongue and the Powder heard from the Cheyenne that the new fort was too strong to be captured without great loss, and they would have to lure the soldiers out into the open where they could be more easily attacked. So this was all a tactic of the Indians. They wanted to draw them out of the fort and attack them. Now, the next morning at dawn, a band of Red Cloud's Oglala stampeded 175 horses and mules from Carrington's herd. When the soldiers came riding in pursuit, the Indians strung them out in 15-mile chase and inflicted the first casualties upon the Bluecoat invaders of the Powder River country. This is the day after they signed this treaty. To them, it's a piece of paper. You've broken the treaty. We're here to figure out how to get rid of you. It's basically what the Indians were saying here. From that day all through the summer of 1866, Little White Chief Carrington was engaged in a relentless guerrilla war with the Indians. None of the numerous wagon trains, civilian or military, that moved about along the Bozeman Road were safe from all these surprise attacks from the Indians. Now, mounted escorts were spread thin, and the soldiers soon learned that they had to expect daily, deadly ambushes. and the soldiers assigned to cut logs a few miles from Fort Kearny were under constant and deadly harassment. Do you imagine that? That's what they put the whites under. And this is not because of the new treaties. This is because of the breaking of all the old treaties, all the murder, all the killing. And this was their strategy with the Cheyenne, with the Oglala, with the Arapaho. And so as the summer wore on, the Indians developed a supply base on the upper Powder River, and their grand strategy soon became very apparent to the military, the U.S. military. They make travel on the road difficult and dangerous. They cut off supplies for Carrington's troops. They isolate them, and they attack them. And so, in a sense, divide and conquer the soldiers. And so, if they were to attack the fort, they knew they couldn't withstand it. So they had to get them out and attack them bit by bit. Now, Red Cloud, he was everywhere. And his allies increased daily. Black Bear, the Arapaho chief, whose village had been destroyed by General Connor the previous summer, notified Red Cloud that his warriors were eager to join in the fighting. Sorrel Horse, another Arapaho, also brought his warriors into the alliance. Spotted Tail, still believing in peace, still wanted peace, and he believed this was the way to go, had gone to hunt buffalo along the Republican, but many of his Brule warriors came north to join Red Cloud. Sitting Bull was there during the summer. He later drew a pictograph of his capture of a split-eared horse from white travelers on the Powder River Road. Gall, Gall, a young Hunkpapa was also there, with a Miniconjou named Hump and a young Oglala named Crazy Horse. That's a familiar name you're going to hear more about. Young Oglala Sioux named Crazy Horse. He invented decoy tricks to taunt, infuriate, and then lure the soldiers or immigrants into well-laid traps where they attacked them. Now, early in August, Carrington decided that Fort Phil Kearny was strong enough to risk dividing his force again. Therefore, in accordance with his instructions from the War Department, he detached 150 soldiers and sent them north 90 miles to build the little fort on the Bozeman Road. And Fort C.F. Smith is what it was called. At the same time, he sent scouts, Bridger and Beckworth, out to communicate with Red Cloud. Now, this was a really difficult assignment, but the two aging frontiersmen went in search of friendly go-betweens. Imagine, you're going to go scout for us now with these Indians that are picking us all off one by one. So in a Crow village north of the Bighorns, Bridger obtained some surprising information. Although the Sioux were hereditary enemies of the Crow and had driven them from their rich hunting grounds, Red Cloud himself had recently made a conciliatory visit in hopes of persuading them to join his Indian alliance. Now again, this Indian alliance that's building, this is 1866. They're building up to what became the greatest Indian alliance before the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which is all right in this territory. And so Red Cloud was reported to have said, "We want you to aid us in destroying the whites." This is the point they had come to. We're going to destroy the whites. And the Sioux leader then boasted that he would cut off the soldiers' supplies when the snows came, and he'd starve them out of the forts and kill them all. Now, Bridger heard rumors that a few Crow had agreed to join Red Cloud's warriors, but when he rejoined Beckworth in another Crow village, Beckworth claimed that he was enlisting Crows who were willing to join Carrington's soldiers in fighting the Sioux. They're old enemies. And so Medicine Calf Beckworth never returned to Fort Phil Kearny. He died suddenly in the Crow village, possibly from poison administered by a jealous husband, more likely from natural causes. These are the stories that were given. So he died. Remember, he was older already. And so by late summer, Red Cloud had a force of 3,000 warriors. And through their friends, the Laramie Loafers, remember those four? That almost comical band of procurement. the Laramie loafers, they managed to assemble a small arsenal of rifles and ammunition. But the majority of warriors still had only bows and arrows. Now, during the early autumn, Red Cloud and the other chiefs agreed that they had to concentrate their power against Little White Chief Carrington and the hated fort on the Pineys. And so before the coming of the cold moons, before winter, they had to move toward the bighorns, and they made their camps along the headwaters of the Tongue. And from there, they were an easy striking distance at Fort Kearny. So, during all the summer riding, two Oglalas, High Backbone and Yellow Eagle, had made names for themselves with their carefully planned stratagems for tricking the soldiers out into the open, as well as for reckless horsemanship and daring hand-to-hand combats and attacks after the soldiers fell into their traps. High Backbone and Yellow Eagle sometimes worked with young Crazy Horse in planning their elaborate decoys. So early in the moon of popping trees, they began tantalizing the woodcutters in the pinery and the soldiers guarding the wagons which brought wood to Fort Kearny. And on December 6th, now we're into winter, a day with a cold wash of air that flowed down from the slopes of the Bighorns, High Backbone and Yellow Eagle took about 100 warriors and dispersed them at various points along the Pinery Road. Red Cloud was with another group of warriors who took positions along the ridgetops. They flashed mirrors and they waved flags to signal the movements of the troops to High Backbone and his decoys. And so before the day was over, the Indians had blue coats dashing about in all different directions because of their decoys that they had put out. And at one point, Little White Chief Carrington came out and gave chase himself. Choosing just the right moment, Crazy Horse dismounted, showed himself on the trail in front of one of Carrington's hot-blooded young cavalry officers, who immediately led a file of soldiers galloping in pursuit of him. And as soon as the soldiers were strung out along the narrow trail, Yellow Eagle and his warriors sprang from concealment in their rear, and in a matter of seconds, the Indians swarmed the soldiers. This was the fight in which Lieutenant Horatio Bingham and Sergeant G.R. Bowers were killed and several soldiers severely wounded. Now, you're going to look at this and you're going to say the Indians are doing what the soldiers did, aren't they? They're attacking indiscriminately. Well, remember, this is Red Cloud's war. This is the Native Americans at war, declaring war, breaking the treaties they signed just so they could get inside the fort and get a look around. They are now on attack mode. Remember, these are the guys who said, we are no longer seeking peace. We're done with peace. You've lied to us so much. You've killed us so much. Murderous. That we're no longer seeking peace. So now they are on the offensive, the Indians. So in their camps that night, after this raid where Bingham and Bowers were killed, and for several days following, the chiefs and the warriors talked of how foolishly the Bluecoats had acted. Red Cloud was sure that if they could entice a large number of troops out of the fort, 1,000 Indians armed with only bows and arrows could kill them all. And sometime during the week, the chiefs agreed that after coming of the next full moon, they would prepare a great trap for the Little White Chief and his soldiers. So by the third week of December, everything was in readiness, and about 2,000 warriors began moving south out of the lodges along the Tongue River. The weather was very cold. They wore buffalo robes with their hair turned in. They had leggings of dark woolen cloth. They had high-topped buffalo fur moccasins. They carried red Hudson Bay blankets strapped to their saddles, and most of them rode pack horses, leading their fast-footed war ponies by lariats. Some of them had rifles, but most were armed with bows, arrows, knives, and lances. They carried enough pemmican to last several days. And when an opportunity offered, small groups turned off of the trail. They'd kill a deer. They'd take as much meat as they could carry on their saddles. And so about 10 miles north of Fort Phil Kearny, they made a temporary camp in 3 circles of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. Now, between the camp and the fort was the place selected for the ambush, the little valley of Pinot Creek. On the morning of December 21st, the chiefs and the medicine men decided the day was favorable for a victory. It's a good day to die, as the Klingons would say. So in the first gray light of dawn, a party of warriors started off in a wide circuit toward the wood train road, where they would make a feint against the wagons. 10 young men had already been chosen for the dangerous duty of decoying the soldiers. 2 Cheyenne, 2 Arapaho, and 2 from each of the 3 Sioux divisions, the Oglala, the Miniconjou, and the Brule. Crazy Horse, Hump, and Little Wolf were the leaders of this small band. And while the decoys mounted and started off towards Lodge Trail Ridge, the main body of warriors moved down the Bozeman Road. Patches of snow and ice along the shady sides of the ridges, but the day was bright, the air was cold and dry. And about 3 miles from the fort, where the road ran along a narrow ridge and descended to Pinot Creek, they began laying a great ambush for the soldiers. And the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, took the west side of the road. Some of the Sioux hid in a grassy flat on the opposite side. Others remained mounted and concealed themselves behind 2 rocky ridges. And by mid-morning, almost 2,000 warriors were waiting for the decoys to bring the bluecoats into their trap. Now, while the war party was making its feint against the wood train, Crazy Horse and the decoys dismounted, and they waited in concealment on a slope facing the fort. And at the first sound of gunfire, a company of soldiers dashed out of the fort and galloped off to the rescue of the woodcutters. As soon as the bluecoats were out of sight, the decoys showed themselves on the slope and moved down closer to the fort. Crazy Horse waved his red blanket, and he darted in and out of the bush that fringed the frozen piney. And after a few minutes of this, the little soldier chief in the fort fired off his big twice-shooting gun, the howitzer, and the decoys scattered along the slope, jumping, zigzagging, yelling to make the soldiers believe they were frightened. And so by this time, the war party had withdrawn from the wood train and doubled back toward Lodge Trail Ridge. And in a few minutes, the soldiers came in pursuit. Some were mounted, some were on foot. They were commanded by Captain William J. Fetterman, who had explicit orders not to pursue beyond the Lodge Trail Road. Now, Crazy Horse and the other decoys now jumped on their ponies. They began riding back and forth all along the slope of the Lodge Trail Road ridge, and they were taunting the soldiers and angering them, so they fired recklessly. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, and decoys moved back slowly. You got all this firing. It looked like something out of a movie. And when the soldiers, they moved back slowly, and the decoys, and the soldiers slowed their advance, or they halted. Crazy Horse would dismount, pretend to adjust his bridle or examine his pony's hooves. Bullets whined all around him. Sing, sing, sing. They're shooting at him. And Crazy Horse All right, folks, thanks for sitting on through that break. Welcome back. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. You're also watching the simulcast on my video YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, where you can also join the live chat room going on right now during this show. Add your 2 cents, meet the other Intrepheads over there. And you can talk about the events of this particular broadcast. You can talk about other things. Everybody talks about everything over there. So come on over and join us on my YouTube channel. And we're right in the middle of this story of Crazy Horse and a couple of the other warriors who were, only 10 of them, they were acting as decoys to draw the soldiers out of the fort and into an ambush where there were 2,000 Indian warriors laying in wait along the road. And so Crazy Horse and the other decoys were pulling them out of the fort. The soldiers only saw the 10 of them, and they were charging their horses to catch them. Now, when the decoys crossed Pinot Creek, all 81 of the cavalrymen and infantrymen were within the trap, the ambush that was laid. Now the decoys divided into 2 parties and quickly rode across each other's trail. This was the signal for attack. When the 10 of them divided and they crisscrossed across the trail and rode off, that was the sign to attack. Little Horse, the Cheyenne, who a year earlier gave the warning to the Arapahoes of General Connor's approach, had the honor of signaling his people, who were concealed in gullies on the west side of the road. He raised his lance, and all the mounted Cheyenne and Arapaho charged with a sudden thunder of hooves. Imagine if you were the cavalry at this time, the soldiers, all coming out, 81 of them, chasing what you thought were 10 Indians, and thousands of them pop up on sides of the road. And from the opposite side came the Sioux, and for a few minutes the Indians and the walking soldiers were mixed in a confused hand-to-hand fight. The infantrymen were soon all killed, all 81 of them. But the cavalrymen retreated to a rocky height near the end of the ridge. They turned their horses loose, tried to take cover among the ice-crusted boulders. Little Horse made a name for himself that day, leaping over rocks and in and out of gullies until he was within 40 feet of the besieged cavalrymen. White Bull of the Minneconjou also distinguished himself in the bloody fighting on the hillside. Armed only with a bow and a lance, he charged a dismounted cavalryman who was firing at him with a carbine, and in a pictograph that White Bull later drew of the event, he showed himself clad in a red war cape, firing an arrow into the soldier's heart and cracking him over the head with his lance to count his first coup. Toward the end of the fighting, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho on one side and the Sioux on the other were so close together that they began hitting each other with their showers of arrows. And then it was all over. Not a soldier, a single one of those soldiers who rode out, was left alive. A dog came out from among the dead, and a Sioux started to catch it to take it home with him. But Big Rascal, a Cheyenne said, "Don't let the dog go." And somebody shot it with an arrow. This was the fight the white men called the Fetterman Massacre. The Indians called it the Battle of the 100 Slain. Now, you can find out information on this, by the way. You can see John Stand's book in Timber and Margaret Library, or the Margot Library. The Cheyenne Memories was the name of the book. It's published in 1967. That's New Haven and Yale University Press. And so the casualties were heavy among the Indians after this Battle of the 100 Slain, as the natives called it, or the Fetterman Massacre, as the soldiers called it. Almost 200 were dead and wounded. And this is of the 2,000 Indians they had there. Because of the intense cold, they decided to take the wounded back to the temporary camp, where they could keep them from freezing. Now the next day, a roaring blizzard trapped the warriors there in improvised shelters, and when the storm abated, they went back to their villages on the tongue. Now it was the moon of strong cold. We're looking at post-Christmas now. And there would be no more fighting for a while. This is January of 1867. The soldiers who were left alive in the fort would have a bitter taste of defeat in their mouths. If they'd not learned their lesson, they were still there when the grass greened in the spring. The war would continue. The Fetterman Massacre made a profound impression upon Colonel Carrington. He was appalled by the mutilations, the disembowelings, the hacked limbs, the, quote, private parts severed and indecently placed on the person, end quote. He brooded upon the reasons for such savagery, and eventually wrote an essay on the subject, philosophizing that the Indians were compelled by some paganistic belief to commit the terrible deeds that remained forever in his mind. Had Colonel Carrington visited the scene of the Sand Creek Massacre, which occurred only 2 years before the Fetterman Massacre, he would have seen the same mutilations, only committed upon the Indians by Colonel Chivington's soldiers. The Indians who ambushed Fetterman were only imitating their enemies, a practice which in warfare, as in civilian life, is said to be the sincerest form of flattery. As shockingly horrific as it is. So the Fetterman Massacre also made a profound impression upon the United States government. It was the worst defeat the Army had yet suffered in Indian warfare, and the second in American history from which came no survivors at all. And Carrington was recalled from the command, reinforcements were sent to the forts in the Powder River country, and a new peace commission was dispatched from Washington to Fort Laramie, another peace commission, which meant another treaty commission. So now the new commission was headed by Black Whiskers John Sanborn, who in 1865 had persuaded Black Kettle's Southern Cheyennes to give up their hunting grounds in Kansas and live below the Arkansas River. Sanborn and General Alfred Sully arrived at Fort Laramie in April of 1867. Their mission at this time was to persuade Red Cloud and the Sioux to give up their hunting grounds. After this loss, they're now going to try to talk them into giving up their hunting grounds in the Powder River country and live on a reservation. As in the previous year, the Brulé were the first to come in. Spotted Tail, Swift Bear, Standing Elk, and Iron Shell came in. And Little Wound and Pawnee Killer, who had brought their Oglala bands down to the Platte in hopes of finding buffalo, now they came in to see what kind of presents the commissioner might be handing out. Man Afraid of His Horses arrived as a representative for Red Cloud. When the commissioners asked him if Red Cloud was coming to talk peace with them, Man Afraid of His Horses replied that the Oglala leader would not talk about peace until all soldiers were removed from the Powder River country. Get the fuck off our land, is basically what Red Cloud was saying by his non-presence. I'll come in and talk peace with you once you clear out and honor your word. Now, during these parleys, Sanborn asked Spotted Tail to address the assembled Indians. Spotted Tail advised his listeners to abandon warfare and with the white men and live in peace and happiness. For this, he and the Brulé received enough powder and lead to go off on a buffalo hunt to the Republican River. Now, the hostile Oglala received absolutely nothing. Man Afraid of His Horses returned to join Red Cloud, who had already resumed raiding along the Bozeman Road. Little Wound and Pawnee Killer followed the Brulé to the Buffalo Ranges, joining their old Cheyenne friend Turkey Leg. Sounds like he attended a Renaissance festival or two. Black Whiskers, Sanborn's Peace Commission, had accomplished absolutely nothing. So before the summer was done, Pawnee Killer and Turkey Leg became involved with a soldier chief whom they named Hard Backsides. You're going to know who this is. You may already know who this is. They called him Hard Backsides because he'd chased them over the long distances for many hours without leaving his saddle. And it's going to be a very familiar name. Later on, they would call him Longhair Custer. So later on, when General Custer invited them to come to Fort McPherson for a parley, they approached the fort and accepted sugar and coffee. Now, this is George Armstrong Custer's first entrance into all this Indian fighting. This is 1867. And they told Hard Backsides that they were friends of the white men, but they did not like the iron horse that ran on the iron tracks, whistling and snorting smoke and frightening all the game out of the Platte Valley. The Union Pacific Railroad tracks were being laid across western Nebraska in 1867. By the way, if you want to see a good television series which totally fictionalizes the laying of the Western Pacific the Union Pacific Railroad and the buildings of the railroads, you may have seen it. Watch Hell on Wheels. That series ended a couple of years ago, and I think it ran 3 or 4 seasons. Excellent series. It's with the Anson Mount played the lead character in that. He's a former Confederate soldier, post-Civil War. Family was killed. Kind of an outlaw Josie Wales type of a character, if you remember the old Clint Eastwood movie. And a gunslinger, but he becomes the foreman for the Union Pacific Railroad. And it's how they built the railroad. That's a good series to watch. You'll enjoy it. But in their search for buffalo and antelope, the Oglala and the Cheyenne crossed the railroad tracks several times that summer. Sometimes they saw iron horses dragging wooden houses on wheels at great speed along the tracks. You're talking about, the cars of the train. And they puzzled over what could be inside the houses that were on the train. And one day a Cheyenne decided to rope one of the wild horses and pull it from its tracks. Instead, the iron horse jerked him off his pony and dragged him unmercifully before he could get loose from his lariat. I don't think they quite understood the technology and the power of the railroad or of locomotive engines. And so it was Sleeping Rabbit who suggested they try another way to catch one of the iron horses. If we could bend the track up and spread it out, the iron horse might fall off, he said. Then we could see what is in the wooden houses on the wheels. And they did this, and they waited for the train, and sure enough, the iron horse fell over on its side, and much smoke came out of it. Men came running from the train, and the Indians killed all but 2, who escaped and ran away. And the Indians broke open the houses on the wheels and found sacks of flour, sugar, coffee, boxes of shoes, barrels of whiskey. They drank some of the whiskey and began tying the ends of bolts of cloth to their ponies' tails. The ponies went dashing off across the prairie with long streamers of cloth unrolling and flying out behind them. These were fabrics. And after a while, the Indians took hot coals from the wrecked engine, set the boxcars on fire. Then they rode away before the soldiers could come to punish them. Now, this incident, and many incidents like this, kept taking place. And so the Indians now started to find a way that they could attack the iron horses. Incidents such as this, combined with Red Cloud's continuing war, which brought civilian travel to an end through the Powder River country, had a strong effect upon the United States government and its high military command. The government was determined to protect the route of the Union Pacific Railroad. But even old war dogs such as General Sherman were beginning to wonder if it might not be advisable to leave the Powder River country to the Indians in exchange for peace along the Platte River. They're thinking, leave the Powder country, let's just move out of there. So late in July, after holding their Sundance and Medicine Arrow ceremonies, the Sioux and the Cheyenne decided to wipe out one of the forts on the Bozeman Road. Red Cloud wanted to attack Fort Phil Kearny, but Dull Knife and Two Moon thought it would be easier to take Fort C.F. Smith because the Cheyenne warriors had already killed or captured nearly all the soldiers' horses there. So finally, after the chiefs could reach no agreement, the Sioux said they're going to attack Phil Kearny, the Fort Phil Kearny, and the Cheyenne went north to Fort C.F. Smith. So on August 1st, 500 or 600 Cheyenne warriors caught 30 soldiers and civilians in a hayfield about 2 miles from Fort C.F. Smith. Unknown to the Cheyenne, the defenders were armed with new repeating rifles, Winchesters. And when they charged the soldiers' log corral, they met with a withering fire that only one warrior was able to penetrate the fortifications, and he was killed. So the Cheyenne then set fire to the high dry grass around the corral. The fire came in on rolling billows like waves of the ocean, one of the soldiers had said afterward. And when it arrived within 20 feet of the barricade, it stopped, as though arrested by supernatural powers. And the flames arose to a perpendicular height of at least 40 feet in the air, made one or two undulating movements, and were extinguished with a spanking slap, like the flapping sound of a heavy canvas on a hard gale. The wind, the succeeding instant, carried the smoke into the faces of the attacking Indians, who improved the opportunity under cover of it to carry their dead and wounded. And this was enough for the Cheyenne that day. Many warriors suffered bad wounds from the fast-firing guns. You had your repeating Winchester, and instead of the single-shot cap and ball. And there were about 20 dead of the Cheyenne that day. So they started back south to see if the Sioux had found any better luck at Fort Phil Kearny. The Sioux had not. After having made several feints around the fort, Red Cloud decided to use the decoy trick, which had worked so well with Captain Fetterman. Crazy Horse would attack the woodcutters' camp. When the soldiers came out of the fort, High Backbone would swarm down on them with 800 warriors. Crazy Horse and his decoys carried out their assignment perfectly, but for some reason, several hundred warriors prematurely rushed out of concealment to stampede the horse herd near the fort, giving the soldiers warning of their presence. So to salvage, they needed a little better organization sometimes. So to salvage something from the fight, Red Cloud turned the attack against the woodcutters, who had taken cover behind a corral of 14 wagon beds, and they reinforced them with logs. And several hundred mounted warriors began making a circling approach. But as at the Fort C.F. Smith, the defenders were armed with breech-loading Springfields, and they faced with rapid and continuous fire from the new weapons. The Sioux quickly pulled their ponies out of range. Then we left our horses in the gulch and charged on foot. A warrior named Fire Thunder said afterward, but it was like green grass withering in a fire, so we picked up our wounded and went away. I do not know how many of our people were killed, but there were very many. It was very bad. Now the two engagements were called the Hayfield and the Wagon Box fights by the white men, who created a great many legends around them. One imaginative chronicler described these as the wagon boxes as being ringed by the bodies of dead Indians, and another reported Indian casualties at 1,137 warriors, although fewer than 1,000 were even there. And so the Indians considered neither fight a defeat, and although some soldiers may have thought of the Hayfield and the Wagon Box fights as victories, you can go look those up, the Hayfield and the Wagon Box fights as victories, the United States government did not see them as victories. Only a few weeks later, General Sherman himself was traveling westward with a new peace council, and this time the military authorities were determined to end Red Cloud's war by any means short of surrender. And so in late summer of 1867, Spotted Tail, he received a message from the new Indian Commissioner, Nathaniel Taylor. The Brûlés had been roaming peacefully below the Platte, and the commissioner asked Spotted Tail to inform as many Plains chiefs as possible that ammunition would be issued to all friendly Indians sometime during the drying grass moon. And so the chiefs were to assemble at the end of the Union Pacific Railroad track, which was then in western Nebraska. And the great warrior Sherman and 6 new peace commissioners would come there on the Iron Horse to parley with the chiefs about ending Red Cloud's war. Now remember, Sherman was the one Civil War vet who had worked very hard to get the homeland back, or at least give the Indians an opportunity to go back and hunt and dwell on their homelands. He had some compassion for the Native Americans. Now Spotted Tail sent for Red Cloud, but the Oglala declined again. Red Cloud had wanted no part of this, no part of any peace talks, and he once again sent Man Afraid of his horses to represent him. Pawnee Killer and Turkey Leg came in, and so did Big Mouth and the Laramie Loafers. Swift Bear, Standing Elk, and several other Brule chiefs also responded to the invitation. Now, you're seeing these same names repeating year after year as they keep sending out peace commissions. And on September 19th of 1867, a shiny railroad car arrived at Platte City Station, and the great warrior Sherman commissioned Taylor, White Whiskers Harney, Black Whiskers Sanborn, John Henderson, Samuel Tappan, and General Alfred Terry alighted out off the train. And these men were well known to the Indians, excepting the long-legged, sad-eyed one who was called General Terry. Some of them would confront one-star Terry's power under quite different circumstances 9 years later on the Little Bighorn. Now, Commissioner Taylor began the proceedings. He said, this is a quote, "We're sent out here to inquire and find out what has been the trouble. We want to hear from your own lips your grievances and your complaints. My friends, speak fully, speak freely, and speak the whole truth. War is bad, peace is good. We must choose the good and not the bad. I await what you have to say." I think he was very genuine about this. They wanted to stop this. All the while, I don't know how fully cognitive they were that they created this problem. And so Spotted Tail replied, quote, "The Great Father has made roads stretching east and west. Those roads are the cause of all our troubles. The country where we live is overrun by whites. All our game is gone. This is the cause of great trouble. I've been a friend of the whites, and I am now. If you stop your roads, we can get to our game. That Powder River country belongs to the Sioux. My friends, help us. Take pity on us." This is the language they knew to speak in. And all through that first day's meeting, the other chiefs echoed Spotted Tail's words. And although few of these Indians considered the Powder River country as their home, they preferred the plains of Nebraska and Kansas, all supported Red Cloud's determination to keep that last great hunting ground inviolate. "These roads scared away all our game," said one of them. "I want you to stop the Powder River Road," said another. "Let our game alone," said another. "Don't disturb it, and then you will have life." "Who is our great father?" Pawnee Killer asked with genuine wonderment. "What is he? Is it true that he sent you here to settle our troubles? The cause of our troubles is the Powder River Road. If the Great Father stops the Powder River Road, I know that your people can travel on this iron road without being molested." See, to them, the Powder River Road was symbolic of whites coming into their land and settling in their land. And so on the following day, the great warrior Sherman addressed the chiefs, blandly assuring them that he had thought of their words all night and was ready to give a reply. He said this, it's a quote. He said, "The Powder River Road was built to furnish our men with provisions. The Great Father thought that you consented to give permission for that road at Laramie last spring, but it seems that some of the Indians were not there and have gone to war. Now, subdued laughter from the chiefs may have surprised Sherman, but he went on, his voice taking a harsher tone. Now, remember, some of them are laughing because that signing of those pieces of paper by only some of the chiefs was a ploy to check out the whites' weaknesses. So he went on, his voice taking a harsher tone. While the Indians continue to make war upon the road, it will not be given up. But if on examination at Laramie in November we find that the road hurts you, we will give it up or pay for it. If you have any claims, present them to us at Laramie. He wanted that road open. Sherman launched into a discussion of the Indians' need for land of their own, advised them to give up their dependence upon wild game, and then he dropped a thunderbolt. He said, "We therefore propose to let the whole Sioux nation select their country up the Missouri River, embracing the White Earth and the Cheyenne rivers, and to have their lands like the white people forever. And we propose to keep all white men away except such agents and traders as you may choose." And as these words were translated, the Indians expressed surprise, murmuring amongst themselves. So this was what the new commissioners wanted them to do: pack up and move far away to the Missouri River? For years, the Teton Sioux had been following wild game westward from there. Why should they go back to the Missouri River area and starve? Why could they not live in peace where the game could still be found? Had the greedy eyes of the white men already chosen these bountiful lands for their own? We all know the answer to that. And so during the remainder of the discussions, the Indians were uneasy. Swift Bear and Pawnee Killer made friendly speeches in which they asked for powder and lead, but the meeting ended with an uproar when the great warrior Sherman proposed that only the Brulés should receive ammunition. When Commissioner Taylor and White Whiskers Harney pointed out that all the chiefs had been invited to the council with the promise of an issue of hunting ammunition, the great warrior withdrew his opposition, and small amounts of powder and lead were given to the Indians. Man afraid of his horses wasted no time in returning to Red Cloud's camp on the Powder. If Red Cloud had had any intention of meeting with the new peace commissioner, Laramie, during the moon of the falling leaves, he changed his mind after hearing Man Afraid of His Horse's account of the great warrior Sherman's high-handed attitude and his remarks about removing the Sioux Nation to the Missouri River. And so on November 9th of 1867, when the commissioners arrived at Fort Laramie, they found only a few Crow chiefs waiting to meet with them. The Crow were friendly, but one of them, Beartooth, made a surprising speech in which he condemned all white men for their reckless destruction of wildlife and the natural environments. He said this, and with this we have to end tonight. He said, this is Beartooth, "Fathers, fathers, fathers, hear me well. Call back your young men from the mountains of the bighorn sheep. They have run over our country. They have destroyed the growing wood and the green grass. They have set fire to our lands. Fathers, your young men have devastated the country and killed my animals, the elk, the deer, the antelope, my buffalo. They do not kill them to eat them. They leave them to rot where they fall. Fathers, if I went into your country to kill your animals, what would you say?